The morning after the funeral, 3 widows sat in the long drawing room at Ellerby Court, and the tea things were brought in on a tray that had not been used since the old master died. Rain moved across the tall windows in slow gray sheets. The fire had been lit late and had not yet caught properly, so the room held the particular chill of a house where the servants had lost the habit of being watched. Harriet Vane stood at the window rather than sitting, because sitting would have required choosing a chair, and every chair in that room belonged to a hierarchy she no longer had a place in. Her gown was black and plain, and had been dyed twice. The dye had begun to fail at the elbows, showing the gray beneath, and she had learned to keep her arms down. Lady Sophronia Ellerby poured. She was 71 years old, and she poured as she did everything, with a small, precise economy that made the act look like a judgment being handed down. 3 cups. She set the first before Cordelia, her own daughter-in-law, widow of the second son, a woman of 30 in bombazine, so fine it caught the light like water. She set the second at the empty place where the solicitor would sit. The third she pushed across the table toward Harriet, without looking up. "For the nurse," Lady Sophronia said. The word landed in the room and stayed there. Cordelia's fan did not move. A footman at the door found something to study in the carpet. Harriet felt the heat come into her face, and had the presence of mind to be grateful that her back was to the light. She had been married to Edmund Vane for 4 years. She had nursed him for 3 of them. The distinction between those 2 facts had never once been permitted to matter inside this house, and it was not going to begin mattering now on the morning after they had put him in the ground. She crossed the room. She took the cup. She did not drink from it. Afterward, when everything had come apart and been put back together in a shape nobody at that table could have predicted, Harriet would remember that she had not been able to say why. Her hand had simply refused. Something in the smell, or the color, or the way the old woman's eyes had come up at exactly the wrong moment. What she did not yet know was that a man had been watching from the doorway for 11 seconds before anyone noticed him, and that he had seen her hand stop. Give the story a moment before you decide who to trust. It is worth the patience. Harriet had come to Ellerby Court at 22 as a governess, and left the position at 23 by marrying the son of the house. That was the whole of it, as the county told it. It was accurate in the way a ledger is accurate. It recorded no figures for the 4 winters she had spent in a room above the stables before Edmund ever spoke to her, or for the way Edmund had first come to her not as a suitor, but as a boy of 9's older brother, standing in the schoolroom doorway, asking whether his nephew was truly as slow as his mother said, and listening to the answer. It recorded nothing of what came after. The physician's carriage in the drive twice a month, the weight going out of Edmund's shoulders across a summer, the nights when his breath had come shallow and she had counted it in the dark with her hand flat on his chest like a woman keeping time for an orchestra that had begun to lose its place. The county called her the nurse. Lady Sophronia had coined it, and the county had adopted it. And now, 6 days after Edmund's death, it was simply what she was. She was 26 years old, and she owned a black gown, a wedding ring she had not removed, and a small tin box of her father's letters. The house she stood in was not hers. The bed she had slept in for 4 years was not hers. She had understood this in the abstract since the day she married. She was understanding it now in the particular, which is a different thing entirely, and which happens in the body before it happens in the mind. The man in the doorway was the Earl of Marchcombe. She learned this the way one learns anything at Ellerby Court, which is to say from a footman, sideways, an hour later. Alastair, Earl of Marchcombe, 38 years old, the late master's godson and the estate's nearest thing to an outside authority, arrived from the north with rain still on his coat, and did not remove it for the first quarter hour he stood in the house. He had a way of being still that made the room's motion look frantic by comparison. He did not greet Lady Sophronia first as rank required. He stood where he had stopped, and he looked at the tea-table for a moment longer than a man looks at furniture. Then he crossed to the fire, took the poker, and set the coals right with 3 efficient strokes. That fire was laid an hour late, he said. His voice was low and level and carried no complaint in it at all. Someone should be told, Cordelia laughed, a bright social sound with nothing behind it. You have been in the house 4 minutes, my lord. Yes, he said, and put the poker back. Harriet had not moved from where she stood with the cup in her hand. He did not look at her. She was quite certain of it. And yet, when he straightened from the hearth and turned toward the table, his path took him near enough that his coat sleeve passed within an inch of her wrist. And he said, without turning his head, without any change in his voice at all, "Do not drink that. It has gone cold." Then he was past her, and he was bowing over Lady Sophronia's hand, and the room resumed. Harriet set the cup down on the sideboard. The tea in it was, she noticed, still steaming. She thought about that for the rest of the day. She thought about it while she folded Edmund's shirts into a trunk that would go to his brother's household. She thought about it while she ate a supper she did not taste. At a table where nobody addressed her, she turned it over the way one turns over a stone found in a field, wanting it to be only a stone. Her wound was old, and it had a shape she could have drawn. It said that she had been let in on sufferance. It said that they had taken her as a kindness, and that the kindness had now expired. 4 years of marriage had not dislodged it because Lady Sophronia had spent 4 years feeding it, one small correction at a time, and because Edmund, gentle and dying and tired, had never been strong enough to fight his mother on Harriet's behalf. He had loved her. He had simply loved her quietly, in rooms with the doors shut. So when a man of rank told her not to drink her tea, her wound translated it instantly, and without effort, into contempt. He had noticed the nurse holding a cup wrong, that was all. The solicitor came on the Tuesday. His name was Mr. Braddock, and he was a small, dry, courteous man from Lincoln, who had handled Ellerby business for 30 years, and he arrived with a leather case and an expression of a man carrying something heavier than paper. He was shown into the library. The library at Ellerby Court ran 2 stories, floor to ceiling in calf and morocco, with a gallery reached by a spiral stair. And it smelled of leather and cold ash, and the faint sweetness of the pipe old Mr. Ellerby had smoked there for 40 years. They assembled. Lady Sophronia in the great chair by the fire. Cordelia, at her right hand, arranged there the way a jewel is arranged in a setting. Harriet, on a hard chair, near the door, where she had put herself, because the alternative was to be put there, and Marchcombe standing. He had been offered a chair. He had declined it without explanation, and taken up a position by the window with his hands behind his back. And from there, he could see every face in the room, which Harriet did not understand until much later. Mr. Braddock read the will of Edmund Vane. It was brief. There was very little to leave. A watch to his nephew, a quantity of books to the parish school, the remainder of a small personal income, £300 a year, terminating at his death, and therefore leaving nothing. To his wife Harriet, he left a piece of furniture, a writing desk, walnut, with a broken drawer which had stood in the schoolroom during her years there, and which she had used to teach a boy his letters. Cordelia made a small sound. It was not quite a laugh. It was the sound of a woman who has been handed the thing she wanted, and is trying to be gracious about it. A desk, Lady Sophronia said. She let the word sit well. He was fond of her in his way. One would not wish to make more of it than that. Harriet's hands were folded in her lap, and they did not move, and her breath came in and went out at exactly the rate it had come in and gone out before. And she looked at the carpet, which had a repeating pattern of pomegranates, and she counted 11 of them. By the window, Marchcombe had gone entirely still. "Mr. Braddock," he said. The solicitor looked up. "How many wills are in your case?" The room turned. Braddock's hand, Harriet saw, tightened on the leather. "My lord, I do not take your meaning." "You brought a case," Marchcombe said, in the same level tone he had used about the fire. "You have read one document from it. The case has not become lighter." There was a silence of perhaps 4 seconds. It was the longest silence Harriet had ever heard in that room. "There is a second instrument," Braddock said. "It is not Mr. Vane's. It is his father's." The old master's will was read 3 years ago, Lady Sophronia said. Her fan had stopped. It was read in this room. I was present. A will was read in this room, Braddock said, and he had gone the color of paper. 3 weeks before his death, Mr. Ellerby executed another and instructed that it be held sealed and unread until the death of his younger son. He was very particular. He gave his reasons. I am not at liberty to characterize them. Nobody spoke. Harriet, who had come into that library expecting nothing and had received a desk, felt the floor of the day shift beneath her, and she looked up, and she found that the Earl of Marchcombe was already looking at her. He looked away at once. It was the smallest thing. A half-second of contact. And then his eyes going to the window as though the rain had said something. Her body knew before her mind permitted it. Her pulse went up in her throat, and she put her hand flat on her knee to keep it still. "Read it," Marchcombe said. "My lord, the instruction was that the family assemble formally, with witnesses, at a date appointed." "Then appointed," he said. "This day fortnight, in this room." Lady Sophronia rose. She rose slowly because she was 71, and she had spent 50 of those years understanding that slowness in a woman of rank reads as certainty. "You presume a great deal, Alistair, for a godson." "I do," he said. He did not say anything else. He simply waited. And the waiting was worse than argument. And after a moment the old woman inclined her head 1 degree, and Braddock wrote a date in a small book with a hand that was not entirely steady. The fortnight that followed was the strangest of Harriet's life. She should have gone. That was the plain fact of it. A widow with nothing has no business in the house of a family that has already begun to speak of her in the past tense. Her sister-in-law had a household in Norfolk, and had written offering with careful phrasing a position that was not quite a position. Harriet had the letter in her pocket. She read it every evening, and did not answer it. What kept her was the desk. She had it carried down from the schoolroom, and the 2 footmen who carried it made no effort to hide their opinion of the errand, and she thanked them by name, and gave them what she had, which was nothing. So, she thanked them twice. It stood in her room by the window. Walnut, scarred with a drawer that had not opened since before she came to the house, because the runner had swollen, and the front had cracked. Edmund had known that drawer was broken. He had known it for 9 years. He had left her the one thing in the house that did not work. She sat with it in the failing light, and she put her palm flat on the lid. And she did not weep, because weeping in that house had a price she could not pay. She thought instead about a summer afternoon in the schoolroom when Edmund had stood in that doorway asking about his nephew, and about the answer she had given, which had been the truth, and which had cost her nearly her place. Then she went and found a chisel. It took her 4 evenings. She worked by candle, and she worked badly at first because she had never done such a thing, and the wood was old and the grain ran wrong. The chisel had come from the stable, borrowed from a groom named Tench, who had looked at her for a long moment, and then handed it over without a single question, which was the kindest thing anyone did for her that month. She set it wrong the first night, and took a curl of walnut off the face of the drawer front, and the pale wound of the raw wood underneath made her sit back on her heels with her hand over her mouth. On the second evening, she took a splinter deep into the pad of her thumb and dug it out with a needle by the fire and went on. Her hands, which had been a lady's hands for 4 years and a governess's before, that cracked at the knuckles from the cold and the work. She learned the drawer the way she had once learned a difficult child, by giving it time and refusing to be insulted by it. She found that the runner had swollen where a window above had leaked for a decade, and nobody had troubled to say so. She found that the crack in the front was not a crack at all, but a joint that had opened, and that a joint which has opened can be persuaded. Mrs. Peake came up on the 3rd evening with a candle of her own, and stood in the doorway watching for a while without speaking. "They are saying downstairs that you have gone strange," she said at last. "I expect they are." "I told them you were mending a drawer." Mrs. Peake set the candle down on the sill, where its light fell exactly where Harriet needed it, and she did not offer to help, because she had 31 years of knowing when help is an insult. It is a poor thing to leave a woman a broken desk." "He knew it was broken," Harriet said. Mrs. Peake looked at her for a moment. "Yes, madam," she said. "He did." She went out. She left the candle. On the fourth evening, the drawer came free. Inside there was a folded letter, and a small key, and a child's copybook, with the alphabet in it, in a 9-year-old's hand, and a pressed sprig of rosemary, gone to brown dust. She read the letter twice, and then she sat very still for a long while, and the candle burned down a full inch, and, outside the window, the rain came on again across the park. It was in the old master's hand. She had seen it on account books. It was dated 3 weeks before his death, and it was not addressed to her. It was addressed to Alistair. She did not read past the first line. She would think about that afterward with something close to pride, because she had wanted to read it so badly that her hands shook. She folded it, and she carried it downstairs, before she could argue herself out of it. He was in the library. Of course he was. He had been in the library nearly every evening of that fortnight, and the whole house knew it, and the whole house had drawn its conclusions about why an earl lingers a fortnight in a house of mourning where there is an unmarried woman of 30 in fine bombazine. He was standing at the gallery rail on the upper level with a book he was not reading. He came down the spiral stair when he heard the door, and he came down fast, and he stopped 3 steps from the bottom when he saw her face. "There was a letter in the desk," she said. "It has your name on it. I have not read it." He did not move. The candlelight came up from below and made the planes of his face into something carved, and his jaw was set hard enough that she could see the muscle work. "You did not read it," he said. "No." "Why not?" She had not expected the question, and she answered it honestly, which was a thing she almost never did in that house. "Because it is not mine." Something went through his face then. It was very fast. It was gone before she could name it, and what replaced it was the same composure he wore everywhere, but she had seen it, and her body had responded to it before her mind gave permission, a warmth climbing her throat that had no business being there in a house. 6 days into mourning. He came down the last 3 steps. He did not take the letter. He stood close enough that she could see the rain still darkening the shoulders of his coat, and he looked at her hands instead, at the cracked knuckles and the raw place on her thumb where the needle had gone in. "You opened the drawer yourself," he said. "It was mine to open." "With what?" "A chisel." He was quiet for a moment. "Sit down," he said. "You are cold." She heard the command. She heard nothing else in it. She sat down because he was an earl, and she was the nurse, and one does what one is told. And she did not understand until much later that he had said it because her hands were shaking, and he had wanted her off her feet. Then he took the letter, and he broke the seal, and he read it standing. It took him a long time. When he had finished, he folded it once, and he put it inside his coat, against his chest, and he stood there with his hand flat over the place where it lay, and he said nothing at all for the space of perhaps 20 breaths. "9 years ago," he said at last, "I advised your father-in-law to send Edmund abroad for his health. Italy, the air. I was young and certain, and I had read a great deal about it. He never went. He never went. His mother would not have it. She said the family would look as though it were fleeing something." His voice did not change at all. That was the terrible part. I did not press. I was 29, and she was formidable. And I told myself that it was not my house and not my son. 3 years later, he could not climb the stairs. Harriet said nothing. There was nothing to say to it. "I have never told anyone that," he said. "You will oblige me by forgetting it." He stood at the door with his hand on it, and did not open it. He wrote that he had lacked courage, he said. He set it down in his own hand to be read after his son was dead, because he could not manage it while the man was alive. "I have spent 9 years despising myself for the same failure, and I find I cannot despise him for it at all." His voice was perfectly level. It had not risen once. "That is the difficulty with this house. Everyone in it is guilty of the same small, quiet thing, and none of us can be made to say so above a whisper. You have just said it. To the nurse, he said, in a library, at 11 at night, with the door shut. The words came out, flat and hard, and she understood, watching his shoulders, that he was not speaking about her at all. He was speaking about every room in that house with its door shut, and about a boy who had not gone to Italy, and about himself at 29, with a correct opinion, and no spine to attach it to. He walked out. He did not bow. His hand did not come away from his chest. She sat alone in the library for some minutes with the fire going down, and she understood, with the awful clarity that comes at 11 at night in a cold room, that the man had not spent a fortnight in this house for Cordelia. The next morning Lady Sophronia sent for her. It was done properly. A note on a tray. The morning room at 11. Harriet came at 11 and stood, because she was not invited to sit, and Cordelia was there with her needlework, which she did not work. You have been seen, Lady Sophronia said, in the library, at night, with a man who is not your husband. I was returning something that was not mine. I am sure you were. The old woman's fan opened one fold. Let us be plain with one another. I have no wish to be cruel. I did not want you in this house, and I have never pretended otherwise. And now that Edmund is gone, I find I am past the age for pretense of any kind. You were a governess. You nursed my son. You did it well. I will say so to anyone who asks. She let that sit. But Marchcombe is 38, and unmarried, and holds 4,000 a year, and there is a season beginning in 11 weeks, and Cordelia is a widow of good family with a jointure and a name. You are the nurse. You will not stand in the way of what this family needs. I do not ask it. I state it. Harriet's hands were behind her back, and the raw place on her thumb had opened again, and she could feel it wet against her palm. I have no intention of standing in anyone's way, she said. Good. Lady Sophronia's eyes came up, and they were not unkind, and that was somehow the whole of the horror of her. Then you will take your sister's offer in Norfolk. I have written to her. She expects you the week after the reading. Cordelia's needle went in and out, in and out. She did not look up. In a house where every attention is a currency, being spent nothing at all is its own message. You are not answering, Lady Sophronia observed. You did not ask a question, my lady. The fan closed one fold. It was the only sign that anything had landed. 4 years, the old woman said, and you have never once raised your voice to me. I have wondered about that. I thought at first it was fear. I have since concluded it is something considerably less flattering. I have no wish to be unflattering. You have no wish to be anything at all. That is the whole of your method. Lady Sophronia turned her head toward the window where the park lay under a low sky, and for a moment she looked simply like an old woman who was tired. My husband indulged you. My son married you. Do you imagine I did not see what you were doing, standing so very still in every room until people forgot to look at you? Harriet said nothing, because the accusation was almost true, and because the parts of it that were not true were the parts she had no words for. The nurse, Lady Sophronia said, and she said it gently, which was how she had always said it, is a perfectly honorable thing to be. I have never said otherwise. I only ask that you be it somewhere else. The clock on the mantel struck the quarter. Cordelia's needle stopped and started again. Harriet went out and closed the door and stood in the passage with her back against the paneling for the length of 6 breaths, and then she went upstairs and packed, because that was what one did, and because there was still a fortnight, and a fortnight is a long time in which to be a person. That fortnight is when it happened. All of it. Not the reading, which everyone remembers, but the small things that made the reading mean anything at all. He found her in the walled garden on a Thursday, kneeling in the wet cutting rosemary. She had not heard him come. She looked up, and he was there against the gray sky, in his dark coat with his hands behind his back, and she scrambled to rise. And he said, "Do not," and she did not. "Rosemary," he said. There was a sprig of it in the drawer. It had been there 9 years. I thought I would put fresh on the grave. Yes. He looked at the garden for a while. It had been let go. The box hedges had gone shaggy, and the beds were half wild, and a bird was making a great deal of noise somewhere. In the espaliered pair, the wall behind them held the last of whatever warmth the day had managed, and the brick was old and soft and furred with moss at the foot of it, and someone 80 years ago had trained a fig against it that had died and never been taken down. It was kept once, he said. There were 4 men in it. I was brought here as a boy and made to walk the paths with my hands behind my back, while your father-in-law told me the Latin names. Do you remember them? Not one. Something almost moved at the corner of his mouth. It was gone before it arrived. He knew I was not listening. He told me. Anyway, I have thought about that a good deal lately. The rain had stopped. It would start again. The light in that country in that month never did more than threaten to be light. They will tell you in London that I am cold, he said. It is not accurate. It is merely useful. Useful to whom? To me. He was quiet a moment. A man who does not press a point cannot be blamed for where the point ends up. I have made a very orderly life out of that arrangement. I recommend it to no one. Harriet turned the rosemary in her fingers. The smell of it came up sharp and clean, and it was the smell of Edmund's last room, because she had put it on the sill there for 11 weeks. He asked for you, she said, in November. He said Alistair would know what to do about the roof. His face did not change at all, and it took her a moment to understand that this was the change. You could have taken the letter to her. He said, Lady Sophronia, it would have bought you a great deal. It would not have been mine to sell. No, he agreed. It would not. He crouched then, which no man of his rank had ever done in her presence in her life, and he put out his hand and turned over the sprig she had cut, examining it as though it were a document, and his glove brushed the inside of her wrist. And neither of them moved for the length of a heartbeat that she felt in her throat, her ears, the roots of her hair. He stood up first. You are going to Norfolk, he said, on the 22nd. Do not. Just that. 2 words. Level. Offered without a single argument attached to them. And then he turned and walked back toward the house with the rain starting again on his shoulders, and Harriet knelt in the wet grass with a sprig of rosemary in her hand and her heart going like something trying to get out of a box. She told herself he had been giving an order about a household arrangement. Her body did not believe her. Her body had not believed her for a fortnight. 3 days before the reading, Cordelia found her on the stairs. You are not stupid, Cordelia said. That is the trouble with you. If you were stupid, I could pity you. She was very beautiful in the gray light, and her mouth was unhappy. He looks at you. Do you imagine I have not seen it? Everyone has seen it. And it will come to nothing, because he is an earl, and you are the nurse, and in 11 weeks he will stand in a ballroom in London, and the whole room will tell him what you are, and he will hear it, and he will be right to hear it. She went past. At the turn of the stair she stopped. I am not wicked, she said. I am only correct. It is a worse thing to be. The reading was set for 11 o'clock in the library, and by 10:30, the room had filled in a way nobody had intended. Word had gone out. Word always did. The vicar came, and 2 of the tenants, and a cousin from Stamford, and old Mrs. Peake, who had been housekeeper at Ellerby Court for 31 years, and had taught Harriet where the linen was kept in her first week, and had never once called her anything but madam. They came because a sealed will is the finest entertainment the county affords. They filled the chairs, and then they stood along the walls under 2 stories of books, and the fire was lit properly this time, and the rain had stopped, and a hard white light came through the tall windows. Lady Sophronia sat in the great chair. Cordelia at her right hand. Harriet came in last and stood at the back by the door, and she felt every eye find her and move on. And she heard, from somewhere near the fire, quite clearly, a woman's voice saying, "The nurse is here," in the tone one uses for a dog that has come into a room where it is not wanted. Mr. Braddock broke the seal. He did it standing. with his thumbnail and the sound of it carried to the back of the room where Harriet stood, a small, dry tearing, like a bird's foot, on a window pane. He read the preamble, first, the formal words, "the being of sound mind and disposing memory," and the room shifted and settled and prepared itself to be bored. It was short. The old master had been a plain man on paper. He had known, he wrote, what his wife was and what she would do. He had watched her make her sons afraid of her, and had lacked the courage to stop it. And he set that down in his own hand for anyone to read. He had watched a young governess argue with him in his own study about his grandson's schooling, and had privately thought it the only honest quarter hour he had enjoyed in a decade. He had watched in his last months that same young woman sit with his dying son at 3 a.m. when the paid nurse had gone to bed. And so he had done what he could do, which was not much, because the estate was entailed and the entail was iron. There was, however, the dower house at Ellerby, and 11 acres, and a charge upon the estate of £400 a year. It had been settled, 3 weeks before his death, upon the wife of his younger son, Harriet, absolutely and in her own right to be held free of the widow's jointure, free of any claim of the estate, and free of the control of any person whatsoever. The room did not breathe. "That is not possible," Lady Sophronia said. "It is executed and witnessed, my lady," Braddock said. "I witnessed it myself. The instrument is sound. He was ill. He was not in his mind. He was quite plainly." She stopped. Her hand had gone to the arm of the chair, and it was gripping it, and Harriet, who had been watching that hand for 4 years the way one watches weather, saw the knuckles go white. "He was in his mind entirely," said the Earl of Marchcombe. He had been by the window. He crossed the room. 3 strides, no more, and the crowd came apart in front of him like water, and he stopped at the front of it where every person present could see him, and he did not raise his voice at all. "He wrote to me the same week," he said. "I received the letter 11 days ago, in this house, from her hand, unopened. When she might have burned it or sold it or used it, she did none of those things." He turned. He looked at Harriet across the length of that room, and he did not look away this time. "Miss Vane," he said. And then, because that was wrong and he knew it was wrong, and he had done it deliberately so that the room would hear the correction and understand what it meant, Harriet someone's fan closed with a snap. "I am asking you to marry me." Before all these people. 11 words. The silence that came after them was not the silence of a room that has been shocked. It was the silence of a room that has been informed. Mrs. Peake put a hand over her mouth. The vicar looked at the ceiling. The cousin from Stamford said, "Well, to nobody at all." Cordelia's needlework was not in her hands, and she had nowhere to put them. And she looked at Harriet, and what was in her face was not hatred. It was recognition. She had been told her whole life that she was the correct choice, and she had just discovered, in front of 30 people, that correctness had never been the question. Lady Sophronia stood up. She had done it 1,000 times in that room, and it had worked 1,000 times. She stood, and she drew breath, and she said, "This family will not." She stopped. She looked around the room. She looked at the vicar and at Mrs. Beebeer, Peake, and at the 2 tenants by the door, and at every face turned toward her. And she saw what was in them, which was not defiance and not anger, but something far worse. It was embarrassment. On her behalf, she sat back down. "The tea," she said. Her voice had gone thin, and it did not carry the way it had carried for 50 years. "The tea on the morning after. I did not. It was only cold. It was only that it had gone cold. Nobody had accused her of anything." That was the moment the room understood. Harriet crossed the floor. She did not hurry. Her black gown had failed at the elbows, and the whole county could see it, and she had stopped caring somewhere around the 2nd stride. She stopped in front of him, and the room held its breath. And she said the thing she had not been able to say to anyone in 9 years in that house. "I want this," she said. "Not the house, not the 400. You. I have wanted it since the library, and I have been ashamed of it for a fortnight." His hand came up. It stopped an inch from her face. It hung there, and everyone saw it hang. And his composure, that thing he had worn like armor since he was 29 years old and had failed to press a point, came apart in front of 30 witnesses in the space of a single breath. "Port. I know," he said. "I have known since you did not drink the tea." He did not touch her. Not there. Not with the county watching. And her husband 6 weeks in the ground. He took her hand instead, the one with the raw thumb, and he turned it over and looked at it, and he bowed his head and pressed his mouth once to the cracked knuckles. And that was all. And it was enough to be talked about in that county for 20 years. The county talked, of course. It talked for 11 weeks without pausing for breath, and the talk went in the direction such talk always goes, which is to say that within a month the story had rearranged itself so that everyone present had known from the first that the old master had done right, and that the nurse had always been a lady, and that Lady Sophronia had gone to Bath for her health. Mrs. Peake gave notice at Ellerby Court in February, and came to the Dower House instead, at lower wages. And when Harriet said so plainly, the old woman said that she had spent 31 years in a house where the fires were laid late, and she had developed an interest in seeing one laid on time. They married in March, quietly, in the parish church, with rosemary in her hands because it was too early for anything else. Lady Sophronia did not come. She had removed to Bath in January to a set of rooms of great respectability and no consequence at all, and she wrote once a year at Christmas in a hand that had begun to shake, and Harriet answered every letter, and never once mentioned the tea, and the old woman never once thanked her for it, and both of them understood the transaction perfectly. Cordelia married a banker in the autumn, and was, by every account, tolerably happy, which is more than the county had predicted, and less than she had been promised. The Dower House stood at the end of the Lime Avenue, small and square and warm, with 11 acres of rough grass that Harriet did not improve because she liked them rough. She kept it in her own name. He had asked once whether she wished to settle it upon their children, and she had said not yet, and he had said very well, and that had been the end of it. He was not a man who asked twice. The first snow came in December. She was in the small parlor that faced the avenue, and there was a fire, and the copybook with a 9-year-old's alphabet in it lay open on her knee because their son was 4 and had begun to ask what letters were, and outside the window the snow came down through the bare limes in the last of the light. Alistair came in with the cold still on him, and stood behind her chair, and he did not say anything, and she did not turn around. The desk was under the window, walnut, scarred, the drawer mended by a joiner from Stamford, who had shaken his head over the chisel marks and asked who had done such savage work to a decent piece. Harriet had told him she had. "Torp." She put her hand back without looking and found her husband's, and the snow went on falling in the avenue. And in the drawer that opened now easily, every time there was a sprig of rosemary, fresh that morning, and nothing else at all. "Thank you for staying to the end of it,"